1944, the very heart of the Pacific jungle. For the American soldiers captured by the Imperial Japanese Army, hell had a name: prisoner of war camp. Here, death came in a dizzying array of forms: starvation, disease, backbreaking labor, and the silence. It was a brutal, crushing quiet imposed by guards who saw surrender as the ultimate dishonor. They outlawed anything that reminded prisoners of their humanity: laughter, conversation, and above all, song. Music was an act of rebellion, a crime punished with savage beatings. But what happens when a weapon of war isn't a bomb, but a song? What happens when the sound of a truck driver from Mississippi, a sound the world barely knew, slices through the silence of pure hatred? This isn't just a story about war. It's the story of how rock and roll managed to free men that bombs couldn't possibly reach. And it's the story of how a group of brutal guards, for the very first time, didn't demand silence. They asked for an encore. Let's pull back the curtain on a place called Cabanatuan, deep in the Philippines. This wasn't just a prison, it was a carefully engineered pit of despair. The air, thick and wet, hung heavy with the stench of dysentery and death. The survivors of the Bataan Death March, already specters of their former selves, were herded here to be forgotten by the world. The days were a blur of grueling labor under a sun that felt like a physical weight. Men, once strong and proud, were reduced to skeletons held together by little more than willpower. Rations were a cruel joke: a handful of maggoty rice, maybe some watery soup. Survival meant getting creative, and getting creative meant eating insects, rats, or anything that crawled. The guards, led by men steeped in the Bushido code, viewed the prisoners with a chilling contempt. To them, a soldier who surrendered had forfeited his right to be treated as a human being. They weren't just guards, they were tormentors. Beatings were a daily ritual, handed out for the slightest infraction, or sometimes for no reason at all. Psychological torment was their sharpest tool. They aimed to dismantle not just the body, but the spirit. Hope was the enemy, and they attacked it relentlessly. They wanted the prisoners to feel utterly alone, to believe that their country had abandoned them and that the only thing waiting for them was a shallow, unmarked grave in the jungle. In this suffocating environment, the human spirit was stretched to its absolute breaking point. Men watched their friends waste away, succumbing to tropical diseases like malaria and beriberi. Every sunrise was a question: would you see the sunset? It was a place designed to erase a man, to strip him of his name, his past, and his future. But even in the deepest, darkest pits of hell, a flicker of defiance can survive. It had to. For these men, holding on to a shred of their identity was the only war they had left to fight. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about simply enduring, about proving to themselves and their captors that they were, in fact, still men. This was the world of Cabanatuan, a microcosm of the war's sheer brutality. It's a place where the lines between life and death were impossibly thin, and where the simplest act of humanity could be a death sentence. It was a world built on cruelty and enforced by a suffocating, soul-crushing silence. And it was into this silence that a revolution was about to be born. But before we continue with the story, please, if you appreciate deep dives into the forgotten corners of history, hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep creating these stories and ensures you won't miss what's next. Go ahead and like this video and drop a comment letting us know what city and country you're watching from. The prohibition on singing wasn't some arbitrary rule jotted down in a rulebook. Oh no, it was far more insidious than that. It was a psychological weapon, honed to a razor's edge. The Japanese command understood something profound. A man who can sing is a man who still has hope. A song is a tether to a world outside the barbed wire. In the cultural context of the Imperial Japanese Army of that era, the act of prisoners singing was seen as a profound insult. It was a sign that their spirits remained unbroken, a blatant act of defiance against the captor's authority. Surrender was meant to be total, a submission of body, mind, and soul. A joyful noise was proof that their mission was failing. The guards patrolled the barracks with a specific ear, listening for the faintest hint of a melody. If they caught so much as a hummed tune, the response was swift and brutal. It was an attempt to sever the prisoners' last connection to home, to their families, to their very identities as Americans. They wanted to create a cultural vacuum. For the American GIs, singing was more than just a pastime. It was a piece of home they carried inside them. Crooning a popular Bing Crosby tune or a heartfelt church hymn was a way to mentally escape the squalor of the camp. It was a way to remember a life of baseball games, Sunday dinners, and pretty girls. These songs were anchors in a storm of despair. They were coded messages of resilience. A chorus of "God Bless America" wasn't just patriotism, it was a collective middle finger to their captors. It was a declaration that even though their bodies were imprisoned, their souls were still flying the stars and stripes. The guards knew it, and they hated it. So the law of silence descended upon Cabanatuan. It was an unnatural quiet, punctuated only by the bark of orders, the thud of a rifle butt against bone, and the groans of the sick and dying. The absence of music made the place feel even more like a tomb, a place where joy had been officially outlawed. This psychological warfare was, in many ways, more damaging than the physical deprivation. It aimed to isolate each man inside his own head, to let his thoughts be consumed by hunger, pain, and hopelessness. Without the shared experience of a song, the community of prisoners began to fray at the edges, which was exactly the point. The guards believed that by silencing their voices, they could eventually silence their spirits. They thought that if they could just stop the music, they could finally break these men. It was a battle of wills, fought not with bullets and bayonets, but with melody and memory. It was a war over the human soul. They were trying to turn men into ghosts long before they died, to make them forget the very sound of their own culture. But they made a critical error. They underestimated the sheer stubbornness of the human heart and its desperate, unyielding need for a song, even if it's only a whisper in the dark. This enforced quiet was the backdrop for an incredible act of rebellion. It created a vacuum, and as physics and history have taught us, a vacuum is always waiting to be filled. The question was, what sound would be powerful enough to shatter a silence that was protected by so much hate? In the suffocating quiet of Cabanatuan, one man decided that silence was a form of surrender he simply wouldn't accept. His name was Sergeant Tex Williams. Tex wasn't a high-ranking officer or a physically imposing man, but he possessed a core of pure, unadulterated Texas stubbornness. He believed that letting the guards steal their songs was letting them win. So he started a quiet little mutiny. Under the cover of the thick, tropical night, Tex would gather a small, trusted group of men in the darkest corner of the barracks. They'd huddle close, so close their shoulders touched, creating a small pocket of humanity in the darkness. The risk they were taking was astronomical. Discovery meant a public beating, or worse. They didn't sing, not in the true sense of the word. That would have been suicide. Instead, they breathed the melodies. Tex would lead them in what could only be described as a whispered hymn. They'd exhale the notes of Amazing Grace or the Battle Hymn of the Republic, their voices nothing more than a soft rush of air. It was a ghost of a song, barely audible even to the men creating it. They had to listen with their hearts more than their ears. This tiny act of defiance was a lifeline. It was a secret ritual that reminded them they were part of something larger than their own individual suffering. They were a choir of whispers against a storm of silence. The tension during these secret sessions was almost unbearable. Every rustle of a palm leaf outside, every distant shout from a guard sent a jolt of ice through their veins. They were constantly on edge, listening for the crunch of boots on gravel that would signal their doom. But the need for this connection outweighed the fear. Tex was the choir master of this spectral orchestra. He'd pick the songs, ones that carried the most meaning, the most memories of home. He was risking his own life, not for an extra ration of rice or a piece of medicine, but for a melody. He understood that you could starve a man's body, but the real death came when you starved his soul. This wasn't just about keeping morale up. It was about preserving a sliver of their culture, of their very being. Each whispered note was a grain of sand saved from being washed away by the tide of Japanese imperialism. It was a tiny, flickering candle in an oppressive, overwhelming darkness, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The men who participated in Tex's whisper sessions were bound by a powerful secret. It created a bond deeper than what they had formed in boot camp or even in combat. They were sharing something forbidden and precious, a secret sacrament of hope that was theirs and theirs alone. It was their own private rebellion. These sessions were small, but their impact was monumental. They were a quiet declaration that the guards could control their bodies, their movements, and their rations, but they couldn't control what happened inside their minds and hearts. The whispers were proof that the spirit of America was still alive and breathing, albeit softly, in Cabanatuan. Tex Williams and his small band of rebels were keeping the flame of hope alive, one breathless note at a time. They had no idea that their tiny act of defiance was just the prelude to a much louder, much more dangerous, and much more revolutionary sound that was about to find its way through the wire. Every so often a small miracle would occur at Cabanatuan, the arrival of Red Cross packages. These were more than just boxes. They were tangible links to a world the men feared had forgotten them. The guards would inspect them with meticulous, suspicious care, confiscating anything they deemed a luxury or a potential tool for escape. The prisoners would watch with bated breath as the guards tore through the packages, their hopes rising and falling with each item that was either approved or tossed aside. Most of the time, what was left was meager: a few letters, some canned meat, maybe a chocolate bar if they were lucky. But one day, a particular package arrived that was different. It looked ordinary enough on the outside, but inside, beneath a layer of stale biscuits, was something extraordinary. Tucked into a cleverly designed false bottom of a tin was a collection of what looked like utter junk: a tangle of thin copper wire, a small, sharp crystal, a few strange-looking metal bits, and an earpiece. To the guards who cursorily inspected the tin, it was nothing. It was a jumble of worthless scraps that had somehow slipped past the censors. They pushed it aside without a second thought, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just allowed a metaphorical Trojan horse to breach the camp's defenses. This wasn't junk, it was a disassembled crystal radio set. The package was addressed to a Corporal Leo Grabowski, a quiet radio engineer from Chicago. As Leo carefully unpacked the contents in secret, his heart hammered against his ribs. He knew exactly what he was looking at. This wasn't just a collection of parts. It was a set of instructions, a blueprint for a miracle. Getting this contraband into the camp had been a long shot, a desperate gamble by military intelligence. They knew that information was as vital as food and medicine. The men in Cabanatuan were operating in a total news blackout. Unaware of how the war was progressing, this little radio could change everything. The risk of possessing these parts was immense. If discovered, it wouldn't be a simple beating. This would be seen as espionage, as a prelude to an organized escape attempt. The punishment would be torture and a slow public execution as a warning to the other prisoners. Leo was holding a death sentence in his hands. But it was also a bomb timer of hope, ticking silently in the dark. The potential reward was worth the terrifying risk. The chance to hear a voice from the outside world, to get a sliver of real news, to feel connected again. It was a temptation too powerful to resist. The decision was made in silence. They had to build it. The parts were distributed among a few trusted men, including Tex Williams, and hidden in the most ingenious of places, sewn into the hem of trousers, tucked inside a hollowed-out book, buried beneath a loose floorboard. The camp had just unknowingly received the seeds of a technological and cultural revolution. That night, the whisper choir had a new energy. They weren't just whispering for yesterday, they were whispering for tomorrow. The hope was no longer just a memory, it was a tangible thing, a collection of wires and a crystal waiting to be brought to life. The Trojan horse was inside the gates, and the real war for Cabanatuan was about to begin. The assembly of the radio fell to Corporal Leo Sparks Grabowski. Back home, Leo had been a whiz with electronics, a man who could coax life out of any machine. Here, his skills would be tested like never before. His workshop was the suffocating darkness of the barracks after lights out. His tools were his own trembling fingers. For weeks, Leo worked in stolen moments of near-total darkness. The other men in his small circle would form a human shield around him, feigning sleep or coughing loudly to cover any accidental noise. Every night was a nerve-shredding tightrope walk. A dropped piece, a metallic click, could bring the guards running. The ingenuity required was staggering. This wasn't a simple snap-together kit. He had to improvise at every turn. The antenna was the most dangerous part. Under the guise of a work detail, they managed to run a thin, almost invisible wire from the barracks up a nearby tree, camouflaging it against the trunk. It was a direct line to the outside world, hanging in plain sight. But the real masterstroke was the antenna's final connection. They ran a wire down to a strand of the camp's own barbed wire fence. It was a breathtakingly audacious move. The very symbol of their imprisonment, the steel that kept them in, was about to become their conduit to freedom. The irony was as thick as the jungle air. Inside, Leo toiled. He used a sliver of a razor blade as a cat's whisker to find the right point on the galena crystal. It was a delicate, frustrating process, requiring the patience of a saint and the steady hand of a surgeon. A dozen times he was ready to give up, convinced it was impossible. His only light came from the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. His only power source was the very atmosphere itself, the radio waves he was trying to catch. The project was a testament to human resourcefulness, a middle finger to the guards who thought they had stripped the prisoners of everything. Tex Williams acted as the lookout, the eyes and ears of the operation. He had an almost preternatural sense of the guards' patrol schedules. He would give a soft bird call as a signal, and Leo would instantly freeze, hiding the components, his body rigid until the danger passed. It was an intricate, deadly dance. The other prisoners, even those not directly involved, could feel a change in the atmosphere. There was a new current of nervous energy, a shared secret that hummed just beneath the surface of the camp's grim routine. Something was happening. Hope, a long-dormant emotion, was beginning to stir in the hearts of men who thought they'd never feel it again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the primitive device was complete. It was a Frankenstein's monster of a radio, a fragile assembly of scraps and stolen wire. It looked like nothing, but it held the potential for everything. Leo connected the scavenged earpiece, his hands slick with sweat. The moment of truth had arrived. The engineering of hope was finished. Now came the most important question. After all this risk, after all this work, would it even work? Would their fragile machine be able to pull a miracle out of the ether, or would it deliver only the same crushing silence they were so desperate to escape? The small group huddled around Leo Grabowski, their bodies tense. The air in the barracks was so thick with anticipation, you could practically taste it. Leo placed the single, crude earpiece to his ear. The men watched his face, searching for any flicker of a reaction. For a long moment, there was nothing. His expression was blank. Then he began to slowly, painstakingly adjust the cat's whisker on the crystal. A chorus of static hissed through the earpiece. It was a frustrating, empty sound, the sound of failure. The shoulders of the men around him slumped. It had all been for nothing. The weeks of risk, the near discoveries, had all been a fool's errand. But Leo didn't give up. He kept adjusting, his touch infinitely gentle, moving the wire by a hair's breadth. He was tuning into the night sky, searching for a ghost. The static rose and fell, a wave of noise that promised nothing. And then it happened. Through the crackle, something else emerged, a faint, distant sound. It wasn't a clear signal from an American armed forces station, which is what they had all dreamed of. It was choppy, fading in and out, likely a rogue transmission from a Filipino resistance cell or maybe a distant Allied base. The men leaned in closer, their eyes wide, trying to hear the sound that only Leo could. Leo's eyes shot open. He passed the earpiece to Tex, his hand shaking. Tex pressed it to his ear, his brow furrowed in concentration. And then he heard it. It wasn't the smooth, comforting voice of Bing Crosby. It wasn't the swinging rhythm of Glenn Miller's big band. It was something else entirely, something wild. In between bursts of static, a sound pulsed through the wire. It was raw, electric, and driven by a beat that felt like a punch to the chest. A man's voice, full of a strange, untamed energy, howled and pleaded over a frantic guitar. It was music, yes, but it was unlike any music they had ever heard before. The earpiece was passed from man to man, each one listening for a few precious seconds. Their reactions were a mix of confusion and pure, unadulterated awe. What in the world was this? It was aggressive, it was defiant, and it was shot through with a kind of dangerous joy. It sounded like a jailbreak put to music. This wasn't the polite, polished music of their parents' generation. This was something new, something born of grit and sweat. It didn't ask for permission, it kicked the door down. It was a sound that didn't care about rules, a perfect anthem for men who were living in a world where all the rules had been broken. For a few glorious minutes, the prisoners of Cabanatuan were the first to hear the future. They didn't know the name for it yet. They didn't know the cultural earthquake it would one day cause. But they understood it on a primal level. This was the sound of freedom. It was a miracle crackling through the airwaves. They had tuned in looking for news of the war, for a message from home. What they found was something far more powerful. They had found a sound that resonated with the rebellion in their own hearts, a sound that made them feel for the first time in years truly, dangerously alive. As the weeks went on, the nightly ritual of listening to the radio became the prisoners' most sacred secret. They'd huddle around the crystal set, passing the earpiece, each man taking his turn to get a dose of the outside world. And more, they chased that strange, electrifying music they had stumbled upon. It became the soundtrack to their defiance. That raw, visceral sound was a shot of adrenaline straight to the soul. It spoke a language of rebellion that they all understood, even if they couldn't name it. And in the retelling of the story, as veterans tried to describe this life-altering sound years later, they reached for the biggest name they could think of. The legend was born. The voice they heard crackling through that primitive earpiece, the story went, belonged to a young man who would one day be crowned the king, Elvis Presley. His name became a powerful shorthand for the musical revolution they had secretly witnessed from halfway around the world, trapped behind barbed wire. Now this is where the story gets controversial, where the lines between memory and myth begin to blur. To the men in that camp, this sound was so earth-shattering, so completely alien, and yet so perfectly familiar, that it had to have a legendary origin. Attaching the name Elvis to it gave the memory a weight it deserved. The music was filled with a kind of forbidden energy. It had a swagger, a sensuality, and a rebellious snarl that was the polar opposite of the rigid, oppressive world they were forced to inhabit. It was the sound of everything the guards were trying to crush: individuality, freedom, and a refusal to be broken. Think about it from their perspective. They were starved, beaten, and surrounded by death. Their world was grey and silent. And then, through a wire, came this explosion of colour and noise. It was a voice that didn't sound defeated. It sounded like it owned the world. It was the perfect antidote to the poison of Cabanatuan. The very idea of Elvis, the hip-swiveling, rule-breaking, parent-scaring icon of rebellion, became the perfect symbol for their own struggle. He represented a future America that was louder, freer, and more defiant than the one they had left behind. Listening to Elvis was like mainlining pure, uncut American spirit. The prisoners became addicted to it. They craved that sound more than food. It nourished a part of them that the guards couldn't touch. The music became their secret weapon, their invisible armor. When they listened, they weren't prisoners anymore. They were rebels, connected to a powerful force from a world away. The myth of hearing Elvis in a POW camp in 1944 is, on the surface, impossible, but it speaks to a deeper truth. They heard the spirit of Elvis. They heard the primal scream of rock and roll being born, a sound so potent that their collective memory fused it with the man who would become its greatest icon. And so, the legend grew. The men of Cabanatuan, listening to a forbidden voice on a secret radio, were being hypnotized. They were falling under the spell of a sound that felt like it could tear down prison walls. The only problem was, they weren't the only ones who were about to hear it. With every successful night of listening, the small group of prisoners grew bolder, and with boldness comes carelessness. They started taking more risks, listening for longer, maybe laughing a little too loud when a particularly wild guitar solo crackled through the earpiece. They were getting high on their own supply of hope, and it was making them sloppy. Patrolling the perimeter one night was Sergeant Watanabe, a man who seemed to have been born with a permanent scowl etched on his face. Watanabe wasn't just a guard, he was a true believer in the imperial cause. He was known for his almost supernatural hearing and a level of brutality that made even the other guards nervous. As he passed the barracks where Tex and his crew were huddled, Watanabe stopped dead in his tracks. He tilted his head, listening intently. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a cough. It was a faint, rhythmic something. A strange, tinny noise that did not belong in the rigidly controlled silence of his camp. His eyes narrowed. Insubordination. That's what it was. He had found it. His hand went to the hilt of his sword, a weapon he used more for intimidation than combat within the camp walls. He moved toward the barracks with the silent, predatory grace of a jungle cat closing in on its prey. Inside, the men were oblivious. One of them, a young private named Miller, had the earpiece pressed to his ear, a look of sheer bliss on his face. He was a million miles away, lost in the sound. Tex was about to signal for him to pass it on when the world came crashing down around them. The flimsy barracks door didn't just open, it exploded inward, kicked off its hinges, and there, framed in the moonlight, was the terrifying silhouette of Sergeant Watanabe. The men froze, their blood turning to ice. The secret was out. This was it. The end. Their tiny spark of hope was about to be extinguished with unimaginable violence. Watanabe's gaze swept across the terrified faces, finally landing on the source of the sound. The jumble of wires in Leo's hands and the earpiece still pressed against Miller's ear. His face, already a mask of fury, contorted into a snarl of triumphant rage. He had caught them red-handed with, what? What was this thing? The silence that followed was heavier and more terrifying than any that had come before. It was the silence of the executioner's chamber. The prisoners held their breath, waiting for the inevitable screams that would follow. They looked at each other, a silent, final goodbye passing between them. For Watanabe, this was a moment he savored. He was about to make an example of these men, a lesson in obedience that no one in Cabanatuan would ever forget. He strode forward, his shadow falling over the huddled group. The air crackled with menace. The party was over. He reached down, his movements slow and deliberate, but he didn't reach for a man to beat. He didn't raise his rifle butt. Instead, his hand shot out and snatched the earpiece from the petrified young private. It was a move no one expected. The confrontation was about to take a very, very strange turn. Watanabe stood over them, a figure of absolute authority, holding the crude earpiece in his hand as if it were a strange, captured insect. The prisoners remained frozen, a tableau of pure terror. They expected a blow, a shout, an order to line up outside for punishment. Instead, Watanabe did something utterly baffling. With a look of contemptuous curiosity, he brought the earpiece to his own ear. He was likely expecting to hear coded messages or news of an American victory, evidence of espionage that would justify the harshest of punishments. What he got instead was something his warrior's mind was completely unprepared for. At that exact moment, the frantic, driving beat of a jump blues song pulsed through the wire. It was loud, chaotic, and unapologetically alive. Watanabe's face, which had been a mask of predictable fury, suddenly went slack. His expression shifted, moving through a rapid series of emotions. First, pure shock, then utter confusion. He didn't understand a single word of the English lyrics, of course, but language was irrelevant. The music bypassed the logical parts of his brain and plugged directly into his soul. He could understand the beat. He could understand the raw, unbridled passion in the singer's voice. He understood the defiant energy. The prisoners watched, mesmerized and terrified. Watanabe just stood there, completely still, his head cocked slightly as he listened. The hard lines of his face seemed to soften for just a fraction of a second. This sound wasn't in any military manual. It wasn't part of his training. It was an alien transmission from another universe. This music was the antithesis of everything his world represented. His culture was one of rigid discipline, of order, of emotional restraint, of the collective over the individual. This music was the exact opposite. It was a celebration of chaos, a sermon of personal freedom, a glorious, messy, individualistic howl. He remained paralyzed, listening intently as the song played on. It was a moment suspended in time. The jungle night, the terrified prisoners, the brutal guard, all of them held captive by a sound born in the juke joints of Black America, now echoing in a prison camp in the Philippines. It was a collision of worlds. The other guards would have smashed the radio to pieces and beaten the prisoners senseless, but Watanabe was different. Perhaps he was more intelligent, or perhaps the music simply struck a strange, long-dormant chord within him. He was confronted with something so powerful and so foreign that his training had no response for it. He was hearing a truth that transcended borders and ideologies. He was hearing the rhythm of a human heart that refused to be disciplined into silence. For a few brief, world-altering seconds, he wasn't Sergeant Watanabe, the feared enforcer of the Emperor's will. He was just a man, listening to a sound that shook him to his core. The song came to an end, crashing into an abrupt silence. The static hissed back into the earpiece. The spell was broken. Watanabe slowly, almost reluctantly, lowered the earpiece from his ear. The silence in the barracks was now a living, breathing thing, thick with dread. What would he do now? The song was over. The only sound was the frantic pounding of hearts in the prisoners' chests. Watanabe stood there, the earpiece dangling from his fingers. His face was unreadable, a stone mask once again. This was the moment, the judgment. The prisoners braced themselves for the explosion of violence they knew was coming. Tex Williams locked eyes with Leo Grabowski. It was a look of grim acceptance. They had a good run. They'd brought a little bit of light into this dark place, and now they were going to pay the price. He prepared himself for the first blow, the crack of bone, the searing pain. Watanabe looked down at the pathetic little radio, a jumble of wires and a rock. Then his gaze lifted and swept over the faces of the terrified men before him. He held them in his stare for an eternity, letting the tension build until it was a physical thing, a pressure in the air that made it hard to breathe. He opened his mouth to speak. The prisoners flinched, and then he uttered two words, not in a shout but in a low, almost husky voice. Two words in Japanese that none of the prisoners understood at first, but the tone was not one of rage. It was a tone of command, yes, but a strange one. He said, "Mawikai." The prisoners just stared, confused. Watanabe's expression hardened with impatience. He pointed a finger, first at the radio and then at the earpiece he was still holding. He repeated the words, this time more forcefully. Mu-ikai. One of the prisoners, a linguist before the war, felt a jolt of disbelief. He knew what it meant. He translated for the others in a shocked whisper. He's saying, one more time. The words hung in the air, completely unbelievable. They had to be mishearing. A brutal guard, who had just discovered their greatest secret, was not about to beat them. He was asking for an encore. He wanted to hear the song again. Leo Grabowski, his hands trembling violently, could only stare at Watanabe, dumbfounded. Was this a trick? Some new, cruel form of psychological torture? But there was no mistaking the look in Watanabe's eyes. It was a raw, undeniable demand. He wanted more. He needed to hear that sound again. After a moment of stunned paralysis, Leo's training kicked in. He fumbled with the cat's whisker, his mind racing to find that specific frequency again. The other men watched, their fear slowly being replaced by a sense of dizzying, surreal wonder. The world had just turned completely upside down. Watanabe didn't ask for silence. He didn't ask for confessions. In the heart of a brutal POW camp, in the middle of a world war, an enforcer of the Japanese Empire had just become the unlikeliest of music fans. He had made the most impossible request. He wanted them to play it again. That night marked a profound, unspoken shift in the camp's dark dynamic. It wasn't the beginning of a friendship. That would be a ridiculous overstatement. The line between guard and prisoner remained etched in blood and barbed wire. Watanabe was still their captor, and they were still his prisoners, but something new had been introduced into the equation. A secret truce was born. Each night, after the final head count, Sergeant Watanabe would appear at the barracks. He wouldn't kick the door in. He'd give a quiet, coded knock. Tex would open it, and the dreaded sergeant would slip inside, sometimes alone, sometimes with one or two other guards he trusted. They would sit in the corner, a strange and silent audience. Leo would fire up the crystal radio, and the small group of Americans and Japanese would huddle together in the darkness, united by a single earpiece being passed from hand to hand. They were co-conspirators in a nightly crime against the rules of war. There was no conversation. There were no shared pleasantries. The gulf between their worlds was too vast for that. But in the shared experience of listening to that wild, revolutionary music, a fragile bridge was built. It was a bridge made of rhythm and blues, a secret pathway across the chasm of hatred that separated them. For the prisoners, the situation was surreal. They were sharing their most precious secret with their most feared tormentor. It was a nightly gamble. Could they trust him? What were his motives? But as the nights went on, a strange, implicit understanding developed. As long as the music played, they were safe. For Watanabe and the other guards, it was an escape. The music was a portal out of the grim reality of their duty, a duty that perhaps weighed on them more heavily than the prisoners knew. It was a taste of a world that was loud and messy and free, a stark contrast to their own lives of rigid conformity and brutal discipline. They never requested specific songs. They didn't have the words or knowledge for that. They simply showed up and listened to whatever the airwaves offered that night. They were passive participants in a cultural phenomenon they couldn't possibly comprehend, yet they were drawn to its power like moths to a flame. This bizarre shared ritual became a complex symbol of their intertwined humanity. It didn't erase the brutality of the daytime. Men were still beaten, and the hunger was still a constant ache. But for a few hours each night, the war was put on hold by a signal from thousands of miles away. It was an unspoken agreement. The guards turned a blind eye to the radio's existence, and in return, the prisoners shared its magic. It was a strange symbiosis, a moment of shared humanity forged in the most inhumane of circumstances, all thanks to a melody that none of them could truly explain. The music had disarmed them, if only temporarily. It had found a common frequency beneath the layers of uniform, language, and ideology. It proved that even in the heart of darkness, the right song could make mortal enemies tap their feet to the same beat. The secret bridge held, night after night. The legend of Elvis in the POW camp is a powerful one. It's the kind of story that feels like it should be true. But now we have to pump the brakes and look at the facts. History, as it turns out, has a slightly different story to tell, one that is arguably even more profound. Let's address the elephant in the room. The war in the Pacific ended in 1945. Elvis Presley didn't record his first single, That's All Right, at Sun Records until 1954, and he didn't become a household name until 1956. So, unless the prisoners had a time-traveling radio, there is absolutely no way they were listening to the king. So if it wasn't Elvis, what were they hearing? What was this revolutionary sound that could mesmerize both American GIs and Japanese guards? The answer lies in the genre that was the direct precursor to rock and roll, a sound that was boiling just under the surface of mainstream American music, rhythm and blues, or more specifically, jump blues. Think of artists like Louis Jordan and his Timpani 5, or Roy Brown, or Wynonie Harris. These were African-American musicians who were creating a high-energy, electrifying new sound in the 1940s. They were taking the structure of the blues, cranking up the tempo and adding a heavy, danceable backbeat. It was raw, raucous, and utterly infectious. What the prisoners almost certainly heard was a broadcast of this race music, as it was then called. It was a sound considered so rebellious and taboo that it was rarely played on mainstream white radio stations. It was the sound of the future, a cultural atom bomb waiting to go off. In the fog of time and memory, it's easy to see how the myth was born. For the veterans telling these stories decades later, Elvis became the perfect symbol for that entire musical earthquake. He was the most famous face of the rebellion, so their genuine memory of hearing a revolutionary sound became fused with his iconic image. This revelation doesn't debunk the story, it deepens it. The fact that it wasn't Elvis makes the event even more incredible. The prisoners weren't just hearing a new pop star, they were unwitting witnesses to the birth of a new art form, one born from the struggle and creativity of Black America. It also makes Sergeant Watanabe's reaction even more fascinating. He wasn't just captivated by a charismatic singer, he was being moved by the very DNA of rock and roll, the blues progression, the driving rhythm, the raw emotional honesty. He was hearing a universal language of struggle and release. The story, passed from veteran to veteran, used Elvis as a powerful metaphor for what they truly experienced, the shock of the new. It was a sound so ahead of its time that, in their collective memory, it merged with the biggest musical revolution they would ever know. So we're pulling back the curtain on the legend to reveal a more complex and poignant truth. It wasn't the king who brought a secret truce to Cabanatuan. It was something older, something deeper, something born from a history of oppression that was about to change the world forever. Understanding that the music wasn't Elvis, but the jump blues and R&B pioneers who preceded him, casts the entire story in a new, more powerful light. Suddenly, this isn't a quirky anecdote about a celebrity. It's a profound story about the very nature of rebellion and liberation. It adds a layer of beautiful, brutal irony. Think about the origins of this music. Rhythm and blues was born from the experience of Black Americans, a community that had known its own form of oppression and imprisonment for centuries. It was music forged in hardship, a sound of defiance against a system designed to keep them down. It was, in its very essence, freedom music. Now picture that music, born from the pain and resilience of one oppressed group, traveling invisibly across the ocean. It finds its way through a barbed wire fence in the Philippines and into the ears of another group of oppressed men, American POWs who had been stripped of their freedom and dignity. The connection is electric. The prisoners didn't need to know the history of the blues to understand its message. They felt it in their bones. The music spoke of struggle, but it wasn't mournful. It was defiant. It was joyful. It was a refusal to be silenced. It was the perfect soundtrack for their own unyielding will to survive. So it wasn't a single man, a rock and roll icon, who provided a lifeline to these prisoners. It was an entire culture of resistance. It was the spirit of an entire people who had learned to sing their way through suffering, to dance in the face of despair. That spirit was so powerful it could reach across the globe. This adds another dimension to Sergeant Watanabe's reaction as well. He wasn't just hearing American music, he was unknowingly hearing the music of America's own internal struggles. He was being exposed to a form of expression that was, in itself, a rebellion against the mainstream culture of the nation he was at war with. The liberation wasn't coming from a famous white face. It was coming from the very soul of Black America. The purest form of rebellion music was liberating men on the other side of the planet. It's a historical irony that is both breathtaking and deeply poignant, a testament to the universal power of art. This story, therefore, becomes much bigger than Cabanatuan. It's about how the songs of the marginalized can become anthems for the imprisoned, how a rhythm born in the Mississippi Delta could offer solace to a soldier from Ohio held captive in the Pacific. It shows that the fight for freedom often sings the same song, just in different languages. The prisoners of Cabanatuan didn't need Elvis. They had something far more potent. They had the authentic, undiluted sound of rebellion itself. They had a direct line to a source of strength that had been tested and proven for generations in the crucible of American history. It elevates the story from a pop culture curiosity to a profound statement on human connection. The invisible thread that tied them all together, the black musician in a smoky club, the American GI in a filthy barracks, and even the Japanese guard in the jungle, was a simple, powerful, and undeniable beat. In January 1945, the war came to Cabanatuan in a storm of gunfire and explosions. The U.S. Army Rangers conducted one of the most daring rescue missions in military history, liberating the more than 500 prisoners left in the camp. The gates were thrown open, and the skeletal survivors staggered out into the light of freedom. The secret radio was smashed in the chaos, its job done. The music stopped. As the former prisoners were processed, fed, and treated for their myriad diseases, the strange nightly ritual with Sergeant Watanabe and the other guards seemed like a bizarre dream. The world of war, with its clear lines of good and evil, had returned. The difficult journey home began. For these men, readjusting to a world that had moved on without them was a challenge all its own. They carried the physical and psychological scars of Cabanatuan for the rest of their lives. The memories of starvation and brutality were things that could never be fully erased. After the war, Sergeant Watanabe was captured and put on trial for war crimes. The case against him seemed straightforward. There were countless testimonies from prisoners about his brutality, his role in the camp's cruel regime. He was a symbol of the enemy, a man destined for the gallows or a long prison sentence. But then, something complicated happened. During the trial, a few of the American survivors, including Tex Williams and Leo Grabowski, were called to testify. They spoke of Watanabe's cruelty, but they also felt compelled to tell the whole story. They spoke of the secret radio, the nightly gatherings, the shared music. They testified about those brief moments of shared humanity. They explained how, for a few hours each night, the enemy became something else, a silent, mesmerized listener. They told the court about his impossible request, Mo Ikai, more. They explained that after that night, while still a strict guard, his random acts of sadism seemed to lessen. This testimony threw the military court into confusion. It didn't fit the simple narrative of absolute evil. It didn't excuse Watanabe's crimes, not by a long shot, but it painted a picture of a man who was more complex than a one-dimensional monster. It complicated the very idea of justice in the aftermath of such a brutal war. The music had saved the prisoners' spirits, and in a strange, ironic twist, the memory of that music may have saved their tormentor from the harshest possible fate. It served as a testament to his capacity for something other than pure hatred, a flicker of humanity that the court was forced to acknowledge. In the end, the war ended, and a final different kind of silence fell, the silence of peace. The music was gone, but its echo remained, a permanent part of the story for the men who survived Cabanatuan. It was a reminder that even in the most absolute darkness, a simple song could change the rules. The shared secret of the radio was the last, strangest chapter of their war. It proved that you could imprison a man's body, but you could never truly cage his soul, especially if it had a good beat. The final silence was a testament to the sound that had once filled it. The legend of Elvis in the POW camp may not be literally true, but the truths it carries are eternal. It's the truth that art can and will blossom in the most desolate of places. It's a story that proves that a single song can indeed be more powerful than an entire army when it hits the right ears at the right time. And perhaps most importantly, it's the truth that even at the absolute height of hatred and dehumanization, the rhythm of the human heart, whether it beats in the chest of an American soldier or a Japanese guard, is always searching for the same universal beat, a beat of connection, of shared experience, of something beyond the war. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey into a forgotten corner of history. The story of these men is a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. What did you think of this unexpected connection forged by music? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. They were forbidden to sing, but in the end, it was a song that gave them the final word. It was music that wrote the last unbelievable chapter of their story. They could imprison their bodies, but they could never, ever manage to silence their souls. What song do you think would give you the strength to survive the impossible? If you found this story as moving as we did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next video. We have so many more stories like this to share with you. Thank you again for watching, and until the next time, take care.